It's 3 o'clock in the morning. The place is Twinbrook, West Belfast, the home of Bobby Sands. In the last hour, the news has filtered through to this community that Bobby Sands has died after 66 days of hunger strike. And in scenes reminiscent of the early days of internment, bin lids have been bashed, car horns have been sounded to alert this community to the fact that Bobby Sands has died.
In our rusty iron chains we cried for our wains, our good women we left in sorrow. As the mainsails unfurled, our curses we hurled on the English and thoughts of tomorrow. Catriona, I've heard that sung very raucously over the years, but it's quite a sombre composition that comes from the pen of Bobby Sands. But I was interested in how Christy Moore, the great singer, came into possession of this song, because he recorded it in 1984, and he recalled that he'd received a number of poems from the Maze prison that were signed Marcella. And he was corresponding at that time with some of the prisoners in what became known as the H blocks. And that was partly because Moore himself had composed this song 90 miles to Dublin town. And this was his reaction to the hunger strikes. And he recalled he was staying at a house in Derry after a H block concert, and a young lad who had been recently released from prison sang that song. And it was then that Christy Moore realised that Marcella was Bobby Sands.
Was Bobby Sands, yeah.
And that, of course, was the name of his sister. So Bobby Sands is memorialised. He's remembered in song, in verse, and of course in prose. But his legacy is also something that really deeply permeates the history of the Troubles, but also the iconography of the Republican movement. So why do you think Bobby Sands remains such a potent symbol?
I think, not least of the reasons is because he had a very beautiful smile. And we often forget that visual imagery really matters. The photographs of Bobby Sands that everyone is familiar with he's this utterly beguiling smile. He looks like a very beautiful young man. There's all of that goes with him. But the reason he is remembered, of course, is because he was the first of the hunger strikers to die in the eventually world-famous hunger strikes that took place in the Maze prison in 1981, when 10 men famously died. They were hugely significant. Obviously, the proximate cause for them and for other protests that took place before them in the prison system in Northern Ireland were to restore special category status to the prisoners. And we can go into that a little more later. But up to that, we had dirty protests, we had a blanket protest. There was a hunger strike previous to this one, which ended in time to save the lives of those who underwent it. This is the first time and the first person to die on hunger strike in Northern Ireland. Now, a whole lot of other things happen, which we'll be discussing during the podcast. And while that's happening, the world is watching, Ireland is watching. It's a very dark time in all kinds of ways, because there are young men dying week after week after week. And what it's doing, I think, I would posit to you, I say, perhaps, would be it's changing the trajectory of the Republican movement in Northern Ireland. That in 1981 things are not great with the IRA, they're losing membership. There's been a decade of absolute horror. The 1970s were the worst decade of the entire Troubles in Northern Ireland. That all changes as a result of the hunger strikes. The IRA starts to recruit magnificently from their point of view as a result of these young men dying. Young men are joining up in large numbers. And the agenda changes in terms of electoral politics. So it's probably one of the most significant moments in the history of Northern Ireland. It would be impossible, really, to overestimate it. But maybe to go back to who exactly was Bobby Sands, who actually initiated these huge changes that we're talking about. So born in Belfast, a native of Rathcoole in North Belfast, which was a flashpoint for pogroms on Catholics at the outbreak of the Troubles. His family were driven out of their home. They moved to Newton Abbey. He left school fairly early and became an apprentice coach builder. Found himself subject to, again, serious harassment by his fellow workers in the firm he was working in there, who told him they didn't want any Fenian scum working with them. His idea was to keep his head down, ignore it, and learn a decent trade. He was prevented from doing that. The family are expelled again, and they move to Twinbrook in West Belfast, and he joins the IRA age 16, as a lot of young men did at that time. So he attempts to make a living in an honest and decent way, finds he can't. His family is the victim of 2 sets of pogroms from loyalist paramilitaries who get them out of their home. And it's in a way a classic trajectory for a lot of the young men who joined the IRA. He was jailed in 1973 for possessing weapons, stayed in jail until 1976. While awaiting trial, he married his pregnant girlfriend, Geraldine. He had 1 son. They went to live in England ultimately in the end. While in the first time, he formed very close ties with Brendan Hughes, famous Brendan Hughes, Darky Hughes as he was known, Jerry Adams and Shana Walsh, who was P. O'Neill, the man who made all the publicity statements on behalf of the IRA. When he got out in 1976, he started his career with the IRA again. He was arrested at the scene of the Balmoral Furniture Company bombing. He was there with Joe McDonnell, who was also later to be a fellow hunger striker and also to die on hunger strike, and 4 other IRA men. They went into the building, no warning, put the customers and the staff down in the basement, planted quite serious explosives around the building. Somebody alerted the RUC there was a gun battle. 2 of his comrades were shot. He and the others were arrested. There wasn't sufficient forensic evidence to connect them to the bombing, so they were charged with possession of a revolver that was proven to have been part of the gun battle that happened there, and sentenced to 14 years in jail. Now, 14 years is an incredibly long time. Yeah. And for active young men who are used to doing the things they were doing, which...
Isn't that an important point about his activities? Because he did have a reputation as being a community worker, you know, when he was out of prison. That he was very engaged in the idea of community activism and community work. And what they did in prison is significant too, isn't it? You know, some of them are teaching themselves Irish, you know, they're writing poetry and
he's
prose.
doing a lot of that.
Yeah, but I mean, that's what I mean about the character of him. And he had an appetite for that and a hunger for it. And obviously he had a creative bent as well. But this I find interesting in relation to how they view themselves as prisoners. You know, what are we here for? How can we best use the time?
And part of that, I mean, it was known as the University of Long-Kesh for a long time, that they were reading an awful lot, as you said. Just before he went on hunger strike, he was reading Rudyard Kipling and finding him very interesting. But he had read a lot of the Marxist literature. He loved James Connolly, he read him. Yeah. He was involved in all of that. And that brings us back to the reason why these protests happened. The 5 demands, as they're called.
I'm looking at
now, what were they?
The significance of removing special category status for those who were sentenced for crimes related to the conflict. This is after the 1st of March 1976. So there's
Having
a change.
been in position since 1972, we have to remember this was not there for a very long time, but it had become very embedded, particularly in the Republican psyche, as a mark of their special status within the prison system. It really mattered to them.
And just to remind people of what the situation was after the 1st of March 1976, all convicted prisoners are then incarcerated in the 800 cell H blocks. Now, why were they called the H blocks?
Because they looked like H.
Because they were shaped in that way. And if you see contemporary photographs from the air, you'll see the obvious H. And what began then, particularly when Kieran Nugent was imprisoned in September 1976.
Maybe, Diarmaid, tell us first, what were the 5 demands? Because I think people find it hard to believe that people would actually die for these things. We're trying to explain.
Well, before their demands, I mean, what they're essentially looking for. Okay, let's look at the 5 demands that they had. They wanted not to have to wear prison issue uniforms, free association, with Republican political prisoners, not to participate in prison work, access to and self-organisation of education and recreation, and 1 weekly visit, letter and parcel.
Yes.
Okay. Now, these demands obviously come on the back of this change of approach from the British.
Yes.
And what we see in September 1976 is this refusal to wear prison-like clothes, and the blanket protest began. So these are prisoners who are now covered only by a single blanket. They're held in solitary confinement, exercise basic privileges, which they would have put in inverted commas, were withdrawn. And, you know, the blanket and no-wash protest was followed in 1978 by the dirty protest, where they are smearing their own excrement on the prison walls. And conditions were absolutely horrific, as you can appreciate this. This wasn't just the men. I mean, in 1980, the women Republican prisoners in Armagh jail.
They joined in the dirty protest. So you had menstrual blood added to the shit on the walls. I mean, it disgusts people now to think of it. But it shows you the lengths to which these prisoners were prepared to go within the bubble of the prison system to get these demands. I mean, Tommaso Fiacco, who was a very active engager with the hunger strikers, he was Catholic Archbishop of Armagh, visited the prison during the dirty protest, and he subsequently told the press, "I was shocked at the inhuman conditions prevailing in H blocks. The stench and filth in some of the cells, with the remains of rotten food and human excreta scattered around the walls, was almost unbearable. In 2 of them, I was unable to speak for fear of vomiting." So that's where we are.
And there were demands that the European Court of Human Rights intervene in relation to this in 1980. The idea being that the treatment of the prisoners was against the Convention on Human Rights. Now, the response of that is that, well, this is self-inflicted, isn't it?
Which indeed it was. I mean, the European Court of Human Rights rejected the claim. There was hope that could be found. I suppose that the Jesuitical argument is, well, we wouldn't be doing this unless we were forced into it by the government's refusal to grant our demands. But that doesn't work. I mean, they could easily have stopped it if they wanted to and done something else, which in fact is what they do. Precisely after that refusal of the European Court of Human Rights, later that year, they decide to start a hunger strike.
So this is October 1980.
October 1980, yeah.
And 7 men began a hunger strike. And they were expecting some kind of a resolution. The interesting thing about that, Catriona, is that they go on hunger strike together. Yeah. It's different from what comes later.
It is.
Where you have staged hunger strikes. They go on hunger strike collectively. And it lasted until the 18th of December 1980. So
that was 53 days, which is a hell of a time.
Yeah. Now, Brendan Hughes is an important character because he is the officer commanding in the prison at that time.
And he instigates and supervises that hunger strike.
Yeah. But they also believed that, you know, they were making progress in the sense that nothing is ever as it seems on the surface when it comes to, you know, public shows of defiance by those who are in power or those who are in government. You know, there were always back channels to see could this be resolved via MI6, as far as we know, in an attempt to bring the hunger strike to an end. The strike was abandoned, it seems, to save the life of the youngest striker. And they were expecting concessions at that point, but of course the concessions were not forthcoming. They were a false dawn, I suppose, and that really is why we have, on the 1st of March 1981, Bobby Sands refusing food.
He becomes the OC during the first hunger strike because Brendan Hughes himself is on hunger strike and indeed, as we know, suffered the ill effects of it all his life until he died, probably prematurely. So Bobby Sands is now the officer in command, and he has an eye to publicity. He starts the hunger strike on the 5th anniversary of the abolition of special category status, so he understands that that's the way it is. Ultimately, 23 IRA and INLA prisoners also took part in the hunger strike, and which lasted until October 1981. The other clever idea that Bobby Sands has is to stagger the strikes. So he goes first. Francis Hughes joins him 2 weeks later. I think Patsy O'Hara comes just after that, and on it goes. And as people die, others take their places. This means that you're never without publicity. It never becomes a thing that sinks into the third page of the newspaper. It's always on the front page. Yeah. So that was a massively effective decision.
And you mentioned Senna Walsh there earlier on, who he's probably Bobby Sands' closest friend.
Yeah.
Bobby Sands doesn't want him to be in charge because he says he won't let me die.
Yeah.
I need someone who will. So he chooses Brendan McFarlane, or Bick McFarlane as he became known. And I think McFarlane regarded that as quite a dubious compliment.
I'm sure he did.
Because, well, the assumption is, well, he will let me die. But, you know...
But it also shows that Sands was contemplating death.
That's what I was going to ask you, yeah.
And that is interesting. He kept a diary for the first part of the first month that he was on hunger strike, when he's relatively well. So it doesn't really give us much insight into what happens later. But let's hear a little bit from that. On the 4th of March, he says, I can ignore the presence of food staring me straight in the face all the time, but I have this desire for brown wholemeal bread, butter, Dutch cheese and honey. Ha! It is not damaging me because I think, well, human food can never keep a man alive forever, and I console myself with the fact that I get a great feed up above if I'm worthy. But then I'm struck by the awful thought that they don't eat food up there. But if it's something better than brown wholemeal bread, cheese and honey, etc., then it can't be bad. So you can see he's in good spirits with this, and it's interesting that that's the food he's dreaming about at the time. On the 16th of March, he comments on his physical condition. And he says, I'm continually wrapped up in blankets but find it hard to keep my feet warm. It doesn't help my body temperature drinking pints of cold water. He would have been drinking quite a lot of water every day and taking salt separately because taking the salt with the water made it less palatable. Yeah. He was advised to do that by one of his friends. I'm still able to take the salt and 5 or 6 pints of water per day without too much discomfort. And then on the 17th of March, St. Patrick's Day, he says, I was thinking today about the hunger strike. People say a lot about the body, but don't trust it. I consider that there is a kind of fight indeed. Firstly, the body doesn't accept the lack of food, and it suffers from the temptation of food and from other aspects which gnaw at it perpetually. The body fights back sure enough, but at the end of the day, everything returns to the primary consideration, that is, the mind. The mind is the most important. But then where does this proper mentality stem from? Perhaps from one's desire for freedom. It isn't certain that that is where it comes from, which is an interesting lack of certainty. Most of the diary is very pietistic, like most Republican writings of this sort are, and certainly were, as we know from the period.
And can you identify a real clarity of purpose and aim?
Yes, well, at this point, I think I'm wondering, we all wonder, does he think this is going to be settled before he dies? I mean, that's the big question here. Yeah. What does his family think about that? All of that is there. But like this stops on St. Patrick's Day. There's a long way to go before the 5th of May when he's going to die.
And Catriona, what about the reaction outside, both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic? I mean, you will recall the emotiveness around the hunger strikes and the profile that they had.
It was huge.
There were people going in to visit these prisoners as well.
There were.
Which gave an added publicity to it.
And there were also what were called comms being smuggled out, which were written on toilet paper and rolled up very tight and smuggled out in people's anuses, which is the way things came and went. There was one guy apparently known as the suitcase because he could smuggle vast amounts of stuff out, stuck up his backside, including a camera and a radio on one occasion. So, I mean, there's something very strange going on there. But this was what they had to do. And that information was getting out to the broader Republican community. They were subsequently published by David Beresford in 10 Men Dead, one of the great masterpieces of this period. So, there's huge publicity. There were a couple of marches in Dublin. I went on the first one, naively believing this to be a march for prisoners' rights in general, to find out very quickly that the people stewarding it were absolute provos, basically, and were basically organising a recruitment campaign. And I got out of it and didn't go back. But everyone followed the story of Bobby Sands daily, what was happening with him, to the extent that there was information coming out. It was written about in the newspapers all the time. And again, he was a beguiling character. That lovely smile, the fact that he wrote songs and poetry, all those things softened the image that we were being given all the time by the British newspapers of this terrorist. He did engage in highly irresponsible behaviour, putting bombs into furniture showrooms is not a way to behave. But here he was now becoming the centre of an extraordinary story which is becoming both national and international. And everyone is wondering, will the British give in and grant at least some of these demands before he dies?
And again,
or will he die?
You know, when you look at what was being said in public and what was going on in private, sometimes there are very different pictures.
Yeah.
I was looking at Margaret Thatcher's own memoirs. Margaret Thatcher, of course, was Prime Minister throughout this period. She's there from 1979 right up to 1991. And she wrote that to the outside world the issue at stake must have seemed trivial, which I don't think is true.
No.
But both the IRA and the government understood that it was not. The IRA and the prisoners were determined to gain control of the prison and had a well thought out strategy of doing this by whittling away at the prison regime. The purpose of the privileges they claimed was not to improve prisoners' conditions, but to take power away from the prison authorities. So you can see where Thatcher is coming from. Now, she said this would give the perpetrators a kind of a nobility almost, or a respectability. This we could not allow. Above all, I would hold fast to the principle that we would not make concessions of any kind while the hunger strike was continuing. The IRA were pursuing, with calculated ruthlessness, a psychological war alongside their campaign of violence, and they had to be resisted at both levels. Now, she describes Michael Foot, who was then the leader of the Labour Party, the opposition, coming to see her. And he certainly wasn't the only one who came to see her to try and get her to move. And this is a classic Thatcher line. I was amazed that this thoroughly decent man could take this line because he was suggesting concessions. I reminded him that the conditions in the Maze prison were among the best in any prison anywhere, well above the general standards prevailing in Britain's overcrowded jails. We had since gone even further in making improvements. I told Michael Foot that he had shown himself to be a pushover. What the terrorist prisoners wanted was political status, and they were not going to get it. Now, that's one account. That's Margaret Thatcher's account. But when you read what is an authorised biography, a 2-volume authorised biography by Charles Moore, who of course is very sympathetic to Thatcher, but he's not uncritical, and he gives us other layers. We have correspondence between Diarmaid Nally, who was a senior civil servant in Dublin.
Secretary to the government,
and Secretary to the government, warning the British government that if Sands dies, this whole thing will go up in flames, you know, and they were invoking the memory of Bloody Sunday in 1972 in relation to the reaction. John Hume, the leader of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, is also pleading with the British government to show some kind of flexibility. But what Charles Moore also reveals is that there were back channels. There was what he describes as a secret channel became the primary means of communication. An associate of the IRA, codenamed Soon, he was involved in discussions at this time. So he says, from Mrs. Thatcher's point of view, the aim was to make no concessions in any way, and yet to entertain the suggestion of some members of the Irish government that some of the groups might be allowed to play a role. But ultimately, there are back channels, aren't there always? Yeah. I mean, I remember John Major later on as British Prime Minister getting up in the House of Commons saying it would turn his stomach to talk to the IRA.
When we know that he was.
You know, so there's that long history as well.
Do you know the question that must be occurring to everybody at this point? What did Gerry Adams think? I mean, he's out there he is the leader of Sinn Féin.
Well, he's the Vice President of Sinn Féin at that stage.
Vice President of Sinn Féin at that stage. There were all sorts of debates going on between the Northern and the Southern leadership. Gerry Adams was opposed to the beginning of the hunger strike. He didn't want it.
And so was Brendan Hughes. Brendan Hughes had been involved in the first one. He didn't agree with the beginning of the second hunger strike.
So what is happening as this progresses with
Well, you
Bobby
see, part of their reasoning, or part of Gerry Adams' thoughts on this is that what's really needed is political education. Yeah. You know, that these strikes are going to be limited in their impact. You know, now this is him not knowing where it's going to go. Where it's going to go in May. By May 1981, and that, you know, whilst these could generate emotiveness and perhaps short-term sympathy, you know, they weren't enough as a strategy for the Republican movement. And, you know, Gerry Adams had said himself, these are not necessarily things he was saying publicly, but that, you know, our biggest weakness as a Republican movement has been the failure to develop a revolutionary politics. You know, so there are those internal
So there's a fair amount of
debates going
turmoil
on.
going on then. And then something happens that nobody expected. Frank Maguire dies. Frank Maguire, to be the independent nationalist MP for Fermanagh South Tyrone, where there is a guaranteed nationalist majority if everyone unites behind one candidate. Now, you don't know and I don't know who made the decision to put Bobby Sands, who is seriously into his hunger strike at this stage. The vote takes place on the 9th of April.
Yeah.
To put him up for election.
Well,
There's nothing to prevent it.
You've raised an intriguing question about contested narratives.
Yes.
And this is the point about the hunger strikes. You know, there is no one overarching narrative of the hunger strikes. I mentioned all of the layers associated with it, both public and private. And there are contested narratives. There are those who came to pen their account of the hunger strike, sometimes at a much later stage, who, you know, perhaps had scores to settle, or who were disputing what they regarded as a distortion or even a simplification of what happened. We don't really know who ultimately made the decision. Republican Sinn Féin at one stage claimed, you know, that they were responsible for this particular strategy. But those contested narratives are also relevant to the period after the death of Bobby Sands as well, which we'll come back to.
They are. But it's a big moment because here we are putting up a candidate for the Westminster Parliament, Sinn Féin, never known to have been thought of or contemplated before. I'd always, I don't know for Adam who did it, but I'd put my bet on Danny Morrison, who knew about publicity better than anybody else did in the Republican side at that time. So with a very short time to go, Bobby Sands is nominated as a candidate for that by-election. The SDLP, who are going to run Austin Curry, reluctantly pull out in order to create a unified nationalist majority, and he wins the election on the 9th
So he's
April.
up against Harry West.
Up against Harry West, who's the leader of the Unionist
He's the
Party
former
at the
leader
time.
of the Ulster Unionist Party.
But it was guaranteed that they would win if there was no split
Was
in
it,
the
though?
nationalist vote. Do you not think so?
I'm looking at the result.
It's 1,500 votes.
30,943 votes for Sands, 29,046 for
Actually,
West.
it's less than 1,500.
It wasn't guaranteed.
No.
A high turnout helped, obviously.
It was a very high turnout.
But it certainly, they maximised their chances of success.
They did.
By, you know, presenting a united front, essentially. And I mean, there were those who would have had misgivings, of course, about this strategy as well.
Of course.
You know, the idea of Bobby Sands MP
Yeah.
might necessarily have been to everyone's taste.
But also there was a hope, I think, expressed by at least some of the Sinn Féin and IRA people, that this would be the one event that would push Margaret Thatcher
Yes.
and the others into granting something, that this is now an MP.
Yeah.
You surely are not going to let an MP starve to death.
And there is an interesting acknowledgement in Thatcher's own memoirs that it was possible to admire the courage of Sands and the other hunger strikers
Yeah.
who died, but not to sympathise with their murderous cause. So, you know, she is acknowledging. What is she acknowledging? What do you think of that assertion by Thatcher?
I think she's giving with one hand and taking away with the other.
Yeah.
But it's her position. That's what she believes. I think her political instincts, which were usually pretty good, are extremely off in this whole event. That what she's doing, in fact, is creating the groundwork for Sinn Féin to become a very successful political party, to increase the ranks of the IRA exponentially, and possibly to arrange for another decade and a half of mayhem and murder. Yeah. That can't have been her intention.
And of course, the well-remembered public line was, a crime is a crime.
A crime is a crime.
And Thatcher had a history, that rhythm of Thatcher's, repeating something 3 times, you know. She did that in relation to the hunger strikes as well.
Yeah.
But again, that public defiance is also at odds with the private reality.
It is. And what's going on back in the Maze prison at this stage? Hunger strikes are very serious things. And what happens is bloody awful. And I'm just going to read a little bit about what happens to the body. By the 40th day without sustenance, the body's fat reserves have been exhausted. The body has begun to feed upon itself. Muscle tissue proteins are broken down into their constituent amino acids and rearranged to support bodily functions. The strength with which the heart pumps blood begins to fade, and the body's ability to adapt starts to break down. The hunger striker begins to lose sight and hearing. Speech becomes slurred, the skin grows dry and scaly, eyes twitch at their sockets and limbs lack coordination. The hunger striker suffers vomiting and difficulty swallowing. There may be internal bleeding, and there are things happening to the brain at the same time, which give rise to an increase in irritability, anger, aggressiveness, and impulsive behaviour. Now, Bobby Sands lasted 66 days before his death. He took only water and salt, as we've said, and his weight dropped from 155 pounds down to 95 pounds. 15 days before he died, medical staff had begun rubbing cream into his body and checking his condition every 2 hours. He was sleeping on a sheepskin rug on a waterbed to try to protect his skin. His eyes were hurting all the time, and he was finding it difficult to read the smuggled comms, the communications that he was getting. Just days before he entered a coma and died, Sands seemed to hear echoes in his head. Journalist David Beresford wrote, quote, his mouth was twisted as if he suffered a stroke. He had no feelings in his legs and could only whisper. So that gives you an idea of what these young men had to go through before they died. And it strikes me that it must get so exhausting that it would be harder to stop than to continue.
Yeah.
To make a decision, people were at him all the time to stop. So many visitors coming in to ask him to get off the strike. And that he must have been too exhausted even to contemplate it, that it was easier to die than to wrestle with that. So maybe now we can see the clip of Marcella Sands and Bobby Sands' mother, who visited him 3 days before he died, describing what his condition was then.
I saw him yesterday afternoon, and his coordination had gone. He was completely blind and very, very weak, but very calm, very peaceful and quite alert.
Mrs. Sands, what do you think of the condition of your son at present?
Oh, I think he's coming up to near the end. I can't see how he can last much longer.
Mrs. Sands, does your son accept that his 5 demands won't be granted now?
I don't know. We don't bring it up now, we just sit and talk of old times. But yesterday he was talking of when he was at school, when he was in the youth club and things like that.
Is there any way you can see a solution coming about that would save his life, even at this late stage?
Well, I still feel that I have hopes in Mr. Hockey. I would appeal to him to try and intervene. I think he does realise that these prisoners' 5 demands are just and not unreasonable, and that if he spoke to Mrs. Thatcher, the whole thing could be settled right away. The fact that Bobby and his 3 friends are on hunger strike, if they came off it tomorrow morning for one reason or the other without the 5 demands, we would be highly delighted to save his life. But the thing is, there's 70 more lads have put the names down, and they will come on and start a new hunger strike. So the thing must be settled now.
It's not end with Bobby's death.
If these 4 prisoners die, do you think that others will take their
Yes,
place?
they are.
Unfortunately, yes. And if, as I say, they came off it, if they didn't feel they could go on with it, there's more to go on.
Won't end with Bobby's death.
There's no end to it.
It's fascinating to watch those 2 poor women sitting there talking about their brother and son. And Marcella Sands says if he came off and his 3 friends came off the hunger strike now without the 5 demands, we would be delighted. They were not egging him on to do this. What they're saying is there's 70 others waiting to step in, and they will go on hunger strike. So the best thing would be to settle it now, because it's not going to end.
But she also
with his
mentioned
death.
Mr. Haughey.
She did.
Charles Haughey, who was the Taoiseach, and Charles Haughey called a general election for
Yes.
June 1981.
Indeed, he did.
Now, Haughey was on the horns of a dilemma. Haughey is coming under huge pressure internally within his own Fianna Fáil party. And remember, his predecessor as leader and Taoiseach Jack Lynch had been criticised from the more Republican-minded within the Fianna Fáil party for being too soft a Republican. Haughey, of course, presented himself as a very different type of leader, but he cannot, as he sees it politically, publicly support these 5 demands. There are warnings, of course, being sent to the British government. There is a lot of focus on the idea that Haughey, as Taoiseach, has to demand of Margaret Thatcher that she backs down. The politics of that are very complicated.
But there's no evidence she would have listened to him.
There's also potential for him to lose a lot of votes over this.
Yes.
You know, and we also have to think of the border counties. And whether or not the Fianna Fáil vote there would suffer, in particular in those areas, as a result. So, and of course, he's desperately craving an overall majority, which he always was in Irish politics. So it's interesting that the reference is made there by Bobby's sister to, well, hockey can do something now, you know. He's really scrambling around.
But when Sands dies, there is a gigantic reaction.
Yeah. And even the night before he died, Katrina, I don't know if you remember this, the night before he died, there was a vigil in Dublin city centre.
There was.
Outside the GPO.
Yeah. They marched to the Dáil.
They marched to the Dáil, and there was a statement delivered to Haughey demanding the expulsion of the British ambassador. Yeah. And then the crowd marched off to Parnell Street. And
it wasn't on a par in the south with the reaction to Bloody Sunday.
Yeah.
It was a very different thing. But in the north, 100,000 people attended his funeral. And I think we have a clip of the funeral. Gigantic numbers of people came to the funeral.
Republican funerals have always drawn a crowd here in West Belfast, but never a crowd quite like this. Quite simply, this is one of the biggest political funerals in the history of Ireland. And here today, a whole community, it seems, has turned out in an obvious, overwhelming show of solidarity for the hunger strikers and the late Bobby Sands.
He was murdered. Maggie Thatcher's a lot the answer for it. She could have took him off at any time she wanted. I believe in everything a man fought and died for. I salute him. To us, he's an Irish martyr, nothing more. And they made him a martyr.
Of course, Thatcher became such a hate figure.
She did.
On the back of the hunger strikes. And there's also, she has another meeting actually with Cardinal O'Fee, Tomás O'Fee, who you mentioned there, who was the Catholic primate of All Ireland. And, you know, Thatcher's memory is of this man arriving into Downing Street. He was not a bad man, but he was a romantic Republican whose nationalism seemed to prevail over his Christian duty of offering unqualified resistance to terrorism and murder. He believed that the hunger strikers were not acting under IRA orders. I was not convinced. And she goes on. Interestingly, Garrett Fitzgerald, who, you know, subsequently becomes Taoiseach, during this period of great political instability, he always maintained that Thatcher's greatest mistake around the hunger strikes was her lack of knowledge of history. That she didn't appreciate the enormity of what was happening and what the ramifications might be. So interventions by the family are really significant, and eventually the strike was called off on the 3rd of October. The families are obviously suffering enormously. They're tormented, and there is pressure on them to intervene. Yeah. You know, when you think of the hunger strikes overall, the whole thing lasted 217 days. 13 survived. So there were those who came off. And this is where characters like Father Dennis Fall, the priest and chaplain, were influential. But also families agreeing that the strikers should be dealt with through medical intervention. There's an awful lot of emotion around that. I was very struck by an interview with Lawrence McKeown.
Yes.
Like, he came off hunger strike after 70 days. 70 days. And do you know what his mother said to him? You did what you had to do, son. Now I'll do what I have to do. And she took him off. And Lawrence McKeown is alive today to write about this and to tell us the story. Paddy Quinn, taken off after 47 days. And Paddy Quinn said to his mother, you back me or you back Maggie Thatcher. Can you imagine being put in that position as a mother? And she took him off it.
Yeah. The mothers were the ones who turned things around at that stage. Thankfully, I mean, Lawrence McKeown, I think, is a qualified historian at this point. He wrote letters to me when I was working in the National Archives, when he was researching things still in prison at that point. I think, did he get out under the Good Friday Agreement? Possibly. But he's still alive. And there must be very complicated feelings about that for the people who went on hunger strike and were taken off against their will.
Now, the prisoners hadn't secured their 5 demands. But concessions were subsequently granted. And you could say that special category status effectively came back into action.
By 1983, they had effectively the 5 demands back in operation again. So,
Now,
I mean, it seems a terrible waste of life.
Well, Thatcher, this is how she framed it again in her own memoir. With the strike now over, I authorised some further concessions on clothing, association and loss of remission. But the outcome was a significant defeat for the IRA.
Au contraire, my dear. They increased their numbers. We know all of this. We also know that it opened the door into Sinn Féin dipping its toe in the water and then plunging its whole feet into the water of electoral politics, which is either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. From Margaret Thatcher's point of view, it can't have been a good thing.
Well, do you know what Charles Moore suggested, one of her biographers? He argues that the prisoner did in fact succeed in substance and by getting a more favourable regime. And he says, it is also true that as a sort of trade-off for her toughness, Mrs. Thatcher came under even greater pressure to move towards political developments, which she would have preferred to avoid. And most damaging to her reputation, had it been known, and to her own conscience, was that she did, in effect, negotiate with terrorists. She never quite admitted this, even privately, but it was so. Mrs. Thatcher herself felt sad about the hunger strike, he says. She admires the strikers' courage, and she quotes him, "You have to hand it to some of those IRA boys." Not a thing you expect to hear.
No.
And she described them as poor devils who knew that if they didn't go on strike, they'd be shot. What a waste. What a terrible waste of human life. And again, you know, you can speculate.
Well, having your cake and eating it is one of her favourite occupations, you know. I mean, sorry, it's just very sad that she's prepared to give these concessions when 10 people are dead and didn't do anything beforehand because she didn't want to hand a so-called victory to the IRA. There are ways of framing this that could have worked for everybody. And we're starting to be framed. You know, Marcella Sands said in that clip that we saw of her, these are reasonable demands. That could have been framed by anybody and was framed by Charlie Hoy, by, to a certain extent, Gareth Fitzgerald, by the European Commission on Human Rights, by MEPs who came to visit Bobby Sands. All of that was done. She was not accept that. She wouldn't buy it. But it was a way that she could have framed concessions to the strikers or even given them 3 out of the 5 demands. That sort of thing might have worked. None of it did.
And the way Danny Morrison framed this on the other side, in one of the most widely quoted comments from this era, is that Sinn Féin could ultimately take power with an Armalite in one hand and a ballot box in the other.
Which
I wonder,
worked.
was there some surprise within their own ranks about the scale of the engagement when it came to the by-election and perhaps...
I don't think they had never experienced a death like this. A young man, much beloved of many people, dying at the age of 27 after 66 days of starving himself. It is an enormous thing. It has gigantic propaganda value because it is the old Terence McSweeney idea. Those who endure the most, not those who inflict the most, are the ones who will conquer.
And remember, you're absolutely right about that, because when you go back to Terence McSweeney in 1920, I mean, his funeral was a hugely important propaganda victory for Sinn Féin, and it internationalised the Irish question.
So it's a double-edged sword in all kinds of ways. Do we want young men to be sacrificing themselves on hunger strike, which is a horrible way to die, as we've heard, for a cause that some of us may not believe in? Certainly in the case of the 5 demands, a lot of people these days may say, was that a sufficient reason for 10 men to sacrifice themselves? From their point of view, yes, it was. But events overtook the whole thing and turned it into the sort of pivot for a huge change in the way Republican policy would proceed. And it starts the move of Sinn Féin into electoral politics, which is a very big deal indeed. Doesn't mean the rest of the 1980s, a lot of the 1990s weren't filled with bombings and misery and shootings from the other side and loyalist atrocities. The usual stuff we all got used to.
But it's also it's going to have consequences, of course, for the SDLP.
Of course it does.
And again, what happens in 1983 is really significant in West Belfast, because Gerry Adams is elected an MP And of course, he's not going to take his seat.
No.
But again, the potential that was there to mobilise the votes.
Yeah,
And to bring a searchlight and a focus. And I mean, Bobby Sands became internationally recognised.
He did. I mean, there are streets in Tehran called after him. There were huge protests in Paris and in other European capitals at his death. It was a huge international story. And he remains an internationally known figure.
Yeah.
People know who you're talking about. But for my own part, what I remember is one of the darkest summers I ever lived through.
Yeah.
That, you know, week after week you were getting news of another death.
Yeah.
This is one of the sadder episodes in terms of potential forestalled, in terms of lives not lived that could have been lived. And I suppose in many ways it sums up the tragedy of the entire episode of The Troubles.
You've been listening to RT's History Podcast, What Were We Like, with me, Diarmaid Ferreter.
And me, Catriona Crowe.
The podcast is available every Monday on the RT radio player or wherever you get your podcasts.
From then I ploughed ahead, me spirits never fail, and landed at the gate just as the ship was sailing. Captain Happy Born said that down and Hardy when I jumped aboard. A cabin found for Paddy, it was down among the pigs. Played some hearty rigs, danced some hearty jigs. The water well we bubbling melting Holyhead. Wished himself was dead, or better off instead. On the rocky road to Dublin, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What